Do you hear this? Okay.
Okay. Great. I should carry this around.
Okay.
Okay.
But you'll be here to make sure we can toggle back and forth. All right. I'm gonna move. Whoops.
I might do that, yeah.
Yeah. So I'll move this a little out of the way, and I'll start out over here, and then. All right. Look at this. Hello.
Excellent. Good. Good. Yeah.
As of May, when our summer school starts, we're back down to CDC's new deadlines of 3 feet, meaning
I see.
students don't have to. But technically, at the end of the semester, we'll have the 6 feet.
Right.
Super
Right.
helpful since we've announced that, with that policy already. But in theory, it's just like 1 for
Got it. Yeah. Okay, when is it supposed to come out on Wednesday evening?
Right.
I mean,
Nice to
it's-
see that. Not to do something.
Okay. You never
Well,
want
on tape, right?
That's one of those.
I don't really, buy it, and that gets on.
Right.
Gets on the internet, all hell breaks loose.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I'm going to take this off to make sure I got it.
Yes,
Yeah.
Are we, we're 6 feet apart, so
Right.
let me.
Right.
I mean, if we're following the 3 foot, whatever. If you're 6 or 8 feet away from someone and you need to pull it down for a second, I'm not, go ahead. But when we're speaking, we're going to take off the mask. That's all. We're not trying to set a bad precedent here, but we are pretty far away from everything. To be in the front, maybe you can set a precedent and move a little closer. I have a bunch of students here, but because most don't put on the camera, I don't recognize everyone, especially with a mask. So you will need to introduce yourself, some of you, if you ask a question later. But thank you.
Is this mine?
What's that? Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
How do we know that we're registered with something, or? So anyone who's registered is already seeing this, and the question is when they can start recording. Okay, good.
We'll wait till like 7.
When does this is not working here to bring anything? Oh, okay, so you'll put that up. Okay, good.
Do you want to just start?
We could just have the first slide up.
Because they'll see them in the corner.
Will they see me then?
Yeah, if you're asking a question, I actually can't hear you. It's a little
I'll use some mic.
I'm going to share the PowerPoint. I want you to tell me if you can also see the speaker on the screen while the PowerPoint is showing.
Okay.
Okay.
I have either screen operating right now. I've seen the 2 co-hosts and the speaker there on the side.
Perfect.
Perfect. Okay.
Good to go.
All right.
All right.
And do you see me by the podium, Mary?
Yeah.
Perfect. All right. Great.
You're all to the side and small, but still on the, and it should be showing on the recorded video on the Zoom recording.
All right. Perfect. All right. right. We're going to wait 2 or 3 more minutes, but everyone who's here, it is a culture credit event. I'm not quite sure how it's going to work with the online environment, but you all. So Mary, what do the students have to do for the culture credit?
For those on the Zoom webinar, if you registered with your Stetson email address, you're good to go. If you registered with a different email address, just put your 800 number in the chat at some point before you leave the webinar.
Okay, and for the students who are here physically, what should they do?
That's a good question. You could pass around a sheet and they can put their 800 numbers, and I'll have that sent over.
Thank you, Dr. Fowler. That would be great. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. And just to confirm, there are people still showing up online, I presume? Are you letting people in as we speak, or are you? Oh, right.
So, Mary, I think we should wait a couple more minutes if people are still kind of signing in, but if you see that we've reached a kind of plateau, then we could start. So do you want to let it?
57 of our 83 participants here.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Yeah, that's great. That's really good. So let us know when we get to like 65 or 70, and I'll start the introduction. Thank you.
Okay, we'll do.
All right. And I'm just curious, for those of you here, how many of you have been to a live academic lecture this semester or year already? Not counting your teacher, but like an actual speaker coming in. No one. Okay, so this is going to be a really nice step forward towards returning our campus to live intellectual vibrancy. I just wanted to. Many of you have live classes, I presume, right? Yeah. Not my class, but. It's okay. All right, very good. What are we at, Mary?
Oh, we're still at 57. All right. Yeah, let's start, because that means some people may just be signing in later, and that's a really good critical mass. So do you want to start the recording, Mary?
Yeah, I started.
Fantastic. So good evening, everyone. Welcome to the, I think, 11th Holocaust Memorial Lecture at Stetson University. This is a series that we established in 2008. It was established by Dr. Cy Weiner, who was a DeLand resident, who endowed a fund for thinking about events of the 20th century linked to the Holocaust, related to his brother, who was a Holocaust educator, Dr. Bernard Weiner. And he passed away, and he's no longer endowing it, but I wanted to mention that the series started, and for the first 8 or 9 years was endowed by Dr. Weiner, with the support of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, which also helped fund some of the first couple lectures. And I know that Dr. Stoltzfus, our guest today, has worked there. It's obviously a center of scholarship on the Holocaust. Since 2008, we've had 10 lectures on an annual or semi-annual basis, hosting leading scholars presenting recently published or soon-to-be published work related to the origins, the course, and the consequences of the Holocaust. And we've tried to time this lecture with Yom HaShoah, which I actually believe is tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken, which is a Holocaust Remembrance Day. That's why it's in April. Some of these scholars who have presented in this series include Mark Roseman, Christopher Browning, Tina Grossman, Paul Jescote, Marion Kaplan, Jan Gross, Jeff Ely, among others. So we've had some leading scholars of the Holocaust in this series. And this year, the lecture is being sponsored by our Campus Hillel organization, directed by Sam Friedman, as well as a Jewish Studies program. Both of those institutions are relatively new at Stetson. So we just started our Jewish Studies program last year, and the Campus Hillel has been around a few years. So I wanted to mention that. As well as Stetson's program in Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, which has been around in various iterations for many, many years. 1957. So thank you. And I also want to mention the Rosenstrasse Foundation, which has worked very closely with Dr. Stoltzfus, and as I'll mention in a minute, is linked to his research, including the research today, which is sponsoring this event and has helped promote it outside of Stetson. Which brings me to our distinguished speaker, Dr. Stoltzfus. Nathan Stoltzfus is the Dorothy and Jonathan Rintles Professor of Holocaust Studies at Florida State University, one of the world's leading scholars of resistance to the Nazi dictatorship. In 9 books and edited volumes published over the past 30 years, Dr. Stoltzfus has helped redefine the field, initiate new debates, and establish fruitful lines of inquiry related to, quote, the history of nonconformity, popular protest, and the range of ways that power has been exercised without physical force, unquote. This work includes a number of books. I'm going to mention a few of them. Social Outsiders in Nazi Germany, co-edited with Robert Galately, which I've used in my Holocaust class and Nazi Germany class. Shades of Green, Environmental Activism Around the Globe. These are edited volumes or co-authored volumes. Courageous Resistance, The Power of Ordinary People. Nazi Crimes and the Law. Protest in Hitler's National Community. The Power of Populism and People, Resistance and Protest in the Modern World. That's coming out this year. And Women Defying Hitler, Rescue and Resistance Under the Nazis. And the point I want to make here before getting into the 2 more monographs is how important this work has been, including the books I'm going to mention in a minute, in establishing kind of a second wave of scholarship on nonconformity in the Third Reich. When Dr. Stoltzfus started doing his research in the 1980s, we had just started to look at nonconformity as something that wasn't focused on outright resistance, military resistance or attempts to actually assassinate Hitler, but the way that everyday people tried to oppose in everyday life the Third Reich or fascism. And we had a lot of work by the 1980s on Catholics and Protestants and workers, but people hadn't really looked at other aspects of everyday life, including women, the home, relationships between men and women, and how those, including intermarriage, could be forms of nonconformity. And Dr. Stoltzfus's 2 most famous works, one, his recent monograph, Hitler's Compromises, Coercion, and Consensus in Nazi Germany. It looks at these themes from a bird's eye perspective, revealing, quote, the numerous strategic compromises that Hitler himself made in order to manage dissent. And his most famous work, Resistance of the Heart, Intermarriage and the Rosenstrasse Protest in Nazi Germany, which was a co-recipient of the prestigious Frankel Prize for the best book on the Holocaust in the mid-90s, spawned a considerable debate among academics about resistance and nonconformity and the character of the Nazi dictatorship throughout the 1990s and 2000s, bringing to, quote, publication the voices of Germans who were otherwise never interviewed about their wartime experiences, not only of Nazi victims, but also of its perpetrators. With that, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce you Dr. Nathan Stoltzfus.
Thank you very much, Professor Kurlander. I'm so pleased to be here. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for this wonderful invitation to give this year's memorial lecture at Stetson University. I'm normally in Tallahassee at Florida State and delighted to be a Florida colleague. I've never been as excited either, I don't think, to talk to such a sparsely scattered audience. Thanks for coming out. I want to talk today about mixed marriages or intermarriage in Nazi Germany, marriages of Jews and non-Jews, and how these marriages actually rescued thousands of German Jews. As a graduate student in Berlin in the mid-1980s, I began asking scholars and survivors, why did these German Jews survive? How do you explain that? The narrative I began hearing was, well, this was out of regard for the Aryan partners. This was out of consideration for the non-Jewish partners in the marriage. This was one of the post-war narratives. You can still read today in various forms, actually. For example, intermarried Jews survived thanks to the Gestapo, as one scholar wrote, or more commonly, this is put in the form of Gestapo regulations is the reason that these intermarried Jews in Germany survived. Another narrative is that intermarried Jews survived in the underground, as if the Gestapo didn't know where they were, but they did know exactly where they were. Others have talked of this survival as sheer fortune or a miracle, as if there had been no agent. But this kind of consideration by the Gestapo did not square with my image of the Nazis, and most importantly to me, it doesn't give credit to these remarkable and courageous women primarily who were the agents of this success. Looking at the survival of these intermarried Jews, the numbers were remarkable. 98% of full German Jews who survived did so in intermarriage, did so because they were married to a non-Jew. Why? Intermarried Jews were, after all, the most loathsome of German Jews for the Nazis. They were bad propaganda. They were a kind of union that no one wanted to admit. Certainly, they didn't prove that Jews were so inferior they couldn't be in Germany. They had these children who were so-called half-Jews. They committed racial treason, perhaps worst of all. You couldn't really commit a crime much more serious than defiling the race in Nazi opinions. The single most important reason is represented by the Rosenstrasse protest. This was a protest of non-Jewish wives in the heart of Berlin in early 1943. These were women protesting the plans of the Gestapo for the imminent deportation of their husbands. Some 2,000 of them had just been arrested in Himmler's so-called elimination of Jews from German territory deportations. The Gestapo's plan was to send them to the work camps in Buna in Auschwitz, work camps in Auschwitz, as I'll explain more soon. The protest symbolizes the defiance that these women had practiced and learned over the course of the dictatorship, and that's a key point. In 1950s and 1960s, post-war West German court documents, legal indictments, showed the case that this street protest on Berlin's Rosenstrasse was the reason that the Gestapo released instead of deporting these 2,000 Jews. In a trial against the Berlin Gestapo chief, in fact, a Gestapo officer from Berlin named Tietze testified that the protest had triggered the release. In Berlin, the Holocaust historian Sybil Milton wrote to me, that was before email, saying, you should go to these and look at these court trial records of Bovensiepen, because the Rosenstrasse protest is actually recorded there, among other aspects of intermarried German life. But getting permission was not intended to be easy. The state prosecutor's office refused my request, saying they didn't know what I was talking about until I could give them a case number. I had to have a number. But they weren't interested in helping based on my description. And so meanwhile, I wrote to various archives around Germany, and in response, I got one archivist who wrote giving me the citation that I needed for my court records. So with that, I made a successful application, but it was only to see these documents for 1 week. I kept going day after day without mentioning it, and after 7 or 8 months, I got an alarmed note that what was I doing there? The archivist himself said, this is all Schneef and Gestern, that is water under the bridge. Why are you pulling this dirt out of the bag? But on the whole, it was a really rewarding experience being there, reading these documents that the court trial had brought together, and also, of course, the testimonies of witnesses, both from the Nazi side and also from the victim side. Remember, this was during the height of the Cold War, and that was when my East German friends seemed to never tire of turning over in their minds or in the conversation the question of how long would it be until capitalism collapsed. A couple points here about the Rosenstrasse protest I want to underline. The first is that these women arrived at Rosenstrasse one by one or two by two to show their loved ones that they had not abandoned them. That was so important. They would never surrender. In a continuous flow of threats and promises, the Gestapo tried day after day to convince them to divorce across the entire 12 years of the Nazi regime. But in more than 90% of these cases, these intermarriages held. It was in vain by the Gestapo. Their key day-to-day defiance was in keeping faith and refusing to divorce. The vast majority of Germans was learning compromise day by day, dancing to Hitler's instructions, moving toward internalizing Nazi values, and by contrast, these intermarried Germans, still some 30,000 of them in 1938, were learning a very different dance, moving in a very different direction. They moved in the opposite direction, learning defiance day by day after standing arm in arm with their Jewish partners with its unimaginable hardships and uncertainties about what would happen to them. This was a key to the protest and culminating event of defiance by the Aryan women married to Jews. I use the word Aryan here because it signified the Nazi sense of the unbridgeable chasm between the super race of Germans, the Aryans, and the subhuman, non-human Jews. Notice that these Aryans married to Jews had opposed the regime from its first days because it was bent on destroying their families. A very rare set of people here. One of them explained to me that her family was the whole meaning for her existence. And 24 participants of the protest I interviewed were not political, but totalitarian Nazism, insistence on regulating sexual relations and marriage, forced them to become political. An important perspective here of these brave women is their capacity that was built up. I like to think of it as resistance muscle. Their marriages, even before Hitler, in fact, required many of them to defy family pressure. So already we're dealing with a selected group of people who knew how to go against the traditional taboos, not to mention the pressure of religious institutions. Many of them had to defy family pressures to get married across this Protestant or Catholic Jewish line. In fact, the term intermarriage originated between Catholics and Protestants. You were not supposed to marry out of your corner. Or I remember one woman told me a story how she said that she was getting married at work and that her new husband was from Austria, and her colleague said, well, God can't bless that marriage. That's a foreigner. And she said, God forbid that I would have said that he was Jewish. Well, I want to make the point as well that the regime quickly became acquainted with who this small group was. It couldn't ignore them. On Rosenstrasse, they knew who they were dealing with. But the regime, nevertheless, for these, the entire Reich period, years, hoped that they would eventually yield to divorce under pressure. Another key point, further underlining the direct connection between the will of these Aryans and the fate of their Jewish partners, was the regular practice of the Gestapo to deport any Jewish partner whose non-Jewish spouse had agreed to divorce or had died. It's a direct link. Finally, this tiny minority of ordinary Germans showed that it was possible, under unimaginable duress, and I think heroism, to oppose not just the Gestapo and Nazi propaganda. They also faced a wall of society. Many Aryans were openly scornful, perhaps reproached by their refusal to fall in line, by their rejection of the glory and honor of the Reich Hitler promised was coming. Of course, I also want to mention here that these had a motivation that other Germans did not have. They were ordinary Germans, but they had this particular motivation for defiance. As I dug into history, I began to see the real narrative of intermarried Germans not as one where the Gestapo wrote the narrative. That's the key. Instead, these Germans wrote their own narrative, these German women, and they deserve the credit for the survival of 98% of German full Jews. Now, this has been eclipsed, I submit, in light of a post-war backbone narrative, namely that German resistance was futile. In fact, after all, high officers of the military had tried and paid with their lives to resist. Now, the assassination model showed that resistors were heroic but feckless, but moreover, they endangered family and friends. Better to lay low, keep your head down. The result was that after the war, tens of millions of Germans knew that resistance was futile. And this overwhelmed and silenced the nonsense of a tiny minority who claimed otherwise. One dear woman, Elsa Holzer, who kept telling me about her trials during the Nazi period, said that after the Nazi period, whenever she tried to talk about it and how she had been pushed out by her family, her sisters would say, "Oh, stop making Papa look bad." So it went on. The intermarried narrative was nowhere near the definition of resistance as post-war scholars made it. That was centrally organized, politically motivated efforts to overthrow the entire Reich. That's not what this is. I called it a resistance of the heart because it involves affect. But it does align with Václav Havel's behavior called the attempt to live in the truth. Havel's modifier, attempt, shows that this resistance is not a one-time act or a condition of having arrived. Every day provided a new challenge for living with integrity. Elsa Holzer told me that if we had calculated, we wouldn't have gone to the street to protest, and they didn't go to protest. They went to show their partners that they were there, and a solidarity developed. She said, "We acted from the heart, and it's surprising what you can do when facing crisis, how much strength you might be able to gain. Take the first step," she said. "We did not begin by thinking whether protests would matter, but," she added, "as the police repeatedly threatened to shoot us down in the streets, and as they didn't do it, we began to get hope that maybe we will prevail." Intermarried Jews who survived because of their intermarriages. Here is one, Wally Grodka, there at the top center. I remember her telling the story of how her child was taken from her when she married a Jew. And furthermore, 5 years later, When they finally managed to have children, they died at birth, and the neighbors danced in a kind of schadenfreude, saying that there go the Jewish spawn. We're thankful for that. Here in your bottom right, you see Victor and Ava Klemperer. This is a very moving story, too. Of course, he survived, and his diaries survived because he was married to a non-Jew. Ava Klemperer moved into a Jewish house with him in 1939. So that just illustrates this, where you go, I will go aspect here. Victor Klemperer said later, listen, if they come for me to cart me off to the east, you've got to stay here. But she refused. The civil courage of intermarried couples is remarkably rare but instructive. It's instructive about how the regime worked, in fact. They violated basic Nazi principles. As I said, this is the Rassenschande poster saying that you can be executed for sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews. This racial purity was what the Nazis were aiming for. They violated the law also in 1941 against friendly relations to the Jews. And like a parable, their story reversed the expected narrative. Only by defying the law and risking their own lives did they rescue Jews, and this was their intention. The closest parallel of everyday defiance in Germany was some 20 or 25,000 Jehovah's Witnesses. They also disobeyed while accepting whatever punishment the regime gave them. That was the price. It's heroic, I think, standing firm and allowing the regime to have its way with you, but not giving in. There are also ordinary Germans, of course, with a different motivation as well. Now, in 1938, Hitler issued an order that his personal secretary, Martin Bormann, called fundamental decisions regarding the Jewish question. The reason Bormann called this fundamental decision was that it altered the significance of the Nuremberg laws in 1935. These laws determined and defined who was Jewish among Germans. It altered the significance of these laws for tens of thousands of Jews. By secret decree, Hitler divided intermarried couples into two parts. The one part were privileged due to their marriages, and they would escape the worst persecutions. In fact, as of 1941, they didn't even wear that yellow star badge identifying you in public as a Jew, and this was an incredible step in the persecution. Of course, it also identified everyone that the regime considered an enemy of the state, a criminal that had to be removed from the Reich. The clear majority of these women of these Germans in intermarriage who were not privileged were actually women. That is, they were non-Jewish women associated or married to German men, and the cost they paid was having the yellow star attached to their front doors, so everybody could see it, so the Gestapo could stop in and do whatever they wanted, really. So these, after the Nuremberg laws, Jews were really not citizens; they were subjects, not protected really by the laws and police. Another decision that Hitler took that's important here was in September 1942. Employers up until then had protected their Jewish employees by designating them as irreplaceable. But Hitler now ordered this would end. The clear majority of Jews working in Berlin's armament factories were intermarried, as you see here. And Albert Speer wrote that when Hitler talked about deporting Jews from the armaments factories in September, he meant Berlin Jews. Now this star here is the yellow badge, the one that Rudy Holzer wore. I remember one fine day, Elsa reached under the mattress and pulled out this crumpled star and said, "You can have it." This was something that she said that her guardian angel, he died well before she did, wore, and she used to smear it with coal dust so it wasn't so bright, wouldn't draw so much attention. On November the 5th, 1942, Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust, introduces the removal of all Jews from German territories. Even the half-Jews imprisoned in camps on German soil would now be banished. One month later, Joseph Goebbels records Hitler's decision that the unprivileged Jews must now be removed, and this included those in intermarriage. In other words, everybody wearing the Star of David was not privileged. The privileged Jews were the ones who did not wear the star. This decision flowed logically from Hitler's decision of September and Himmler's decision of the previous month on November the 5th about clearing Jews from Reich territory. It also flowed from Hitler's decision a year earlier, in August 1941, to require German Jews to wear that star in public. The badge marked Jews as enemies, as criminals, and Goebbels writes this, criminalizes them. Projecting forward in this trajectory, most of Berlin's non-privileged intermarried Jews, those wearing the star, would soon be arrested and imprisoned on Rosenstrasse. In a further logical progression of decisions, Goebbels announced his decision to clear Berlin of Jews on February the 18th. The Jews in Berlin will now once and for all be pushed out. With the final deadline of February 28th, they are supposed to be first collected in camps and then deported up to 2,000, batch by batch, day by day. I have put myself to the task to make Berlin entirely free of Jews by the middle or the end of March at the latest. Well, this meant, according to Goebbels' diaries, as we just said, to clear Berlin of Jews meant for him clearing all of the people in Berlin wearing the star. Later in April, he says, there are still people running around wearing the star. I'm going to either have to take their star off or get them out of here. But there was no more systematic effort to deport the intermarried Jews. Meanwhile, and I think this is a key point, the push from Berlin to get rid of all Jews wearing the star was matched by a pull from the economic SS and the armaments factories that had relocated to Auschwitz, e.g. Farben. There you see Runa Manowitz. Here, in a further logical development, the regime sought to solve two problems at once. The first was that in Auschwitz there were 6,000 Polish Jews that they were fearing were collaborating and might have an uprising. And so these 6,000 Jews who were working were taken out and dispersed across the Reich in various camps, thought to be plotting an uprising. And in turn, the Reich Security Main Office in Berlin promised to replace them with skilled Jewish workers from Berlin, 15,000 in fact. Here you see their communication. The transports of Jews from Berlin will begin on March the 1st, and in fact it did. On these transports, there will be 15,000 healthy Jews fully able to work who previously worked in the Berlin arms industry. Well, that part didn't happen because of the Rosenstrasse protest. Thus, as preparations in Berlin were proceeding for Goebbels to declare Berlin Jew-free, in Auschwitz there were counter-preparations for the arrival of 15,000 Jews from the Reich capital. Critically, not even 9,000 skilled Berlin Jewish workers were available without including intermarried Jews. In other words, they would never reach this number they were talking about of skilled Jewish workers without having intermarried Jews on the train. And in fact, on March the 4th, 25 intermarried Jews from Rosenstrasse, among these 2,000, were selected and sent off as protective custody cases to Auschwitz and sent straight to the work camp. Well, beginning on February 27, 1943, 300 covered furniture trucks fanned out across the Reich capital, arresting Jews. Anyone seen on the streets wearing the yellow badge was thrown onto the back of the truck and carted off to these temporary holding centers. There were 5. One of these was at Rosenstrasse 2-4. That's the address where intermarried Jews were collected. They were separated for deportation to the labor camp at Auschwitz. Already on the evening of that arrest, February 27th, Charlotte Israel told me a group of women who met each other on Rosenstrasse agreed to come back the next day and make a scene. Just express their opposition. And early the next morning, as she told the court, Annie Ratlauer, as she approached Rosenstrasse to show her solidarity, heard a group of protesting women calling out together, "Give us our husbands back." The closer she came, the louder the call. Corresponding with the intention to send these Jews to Auschwitz as laborers, 25 of these Jews, as I said, were sent on a separate train car and put to work. Now, Goebbels responds to this on March the 6th. The people gathered together in large throngs. I will commission the security police not to continue the Jewish evacuations during such a critical time. The basic malady of our leadership, and above all our administration, consists in operating according to the letter of orders. One has the impression that these people who carry out this or that measure don't reflect a whit, but rather hang to the written word. And this is a critical intervention in the scholarly narratives about how the regime operated. Many see it as a steamroller ordering from Berlin what was supposed to happen, with the subordinates following up, not improvising, not changing a letter of the law. But that's not the way Hitler set up his regime, where people were supposed to work toward the Führer and imagine at every turn how would Hitler handle this, and how can we compromise, maybe move sideways a little bit laterally until we can move forward again. It's not as if it's not as if Hitler or Goebbels saw this as a major defeat to release the Jews, but as an episode. That's what Goebbels' director called it, an episode. His deputy. And he also said that Goebbels released these Jews just to get that protest out of the world. Clear the protest. The protest was already causing some disagreements in the Reich Security Office, in Eichmann's office and above, about how do you handle this. And that's one interesting thing about protest. Once you show an alternative narrative, then you throw things up in the air, and people start discussing. These people were all on the same memo, same message until the protest. It was easy for them to know what to do. But some of them wanted to go with brute force against these, and some, of course, Goebbels represented as the Gauleiter of Berlin, the regional director of Berlin. He represented the sense that that the public mood was important, and after all, he had just been introducing measures of total war after the debacle that Germany experienced at the Battle of Stalingrad, and Allies were bombing day and night now in Berlin, and the mood was repressed, and his total war measures had nowhere to go than to the people, to ask them to make further sacrifices. And I think that was National Socialism. I don't think Hitler had Plan B either. He just kept trying to mobilize the people with more and more sacrifice and sort of trying to convince them that this was in their best interest. A key point here with implications for scholarly narratives, like I say, is not only Goebbels' fury about people just following orders, but also the common mechanism of cumulative radicalization. That's an important scholarly concept that shows and argues that people carrying out Hitler's orders, trying to please Hitler, kept escalating the radical measures taken against Jews. And that works much better outside of the Reich than inside, where the Hitler myth was important. Only inside the Reich, among our own people, Hitler's race, people he was trying to educate. The Hitler myth really mattered, and Hitler's image had to be upheld. So I think the cumulative radicalization thesis is a little weaker inside the Third Reich. Now, Goebbels, 3 days after ordering the release of the Jews, makes his way to Hitler and makes sure Hitler has his back, and it's very important. The reason is in his diary. The Fuhrer has the greatest understanding for the psychological questions of the war. Psychological questions in Nazi lingo is where you get some dissonance between policies the Nazis want and the public opinion, popular opinion, what the people want. And the Fuhrer did back him. After all, this was important. There were certainly rivalries among Hitler's his lackeys or his lieutenants. Himmler and his men at Auschwitz had been expecting workers. They didn't, their bailiwick wasn't the mood. But Goebbels really, as one historian, Ian Kershaw, the most prominent interpreter of Nazi history, said that if he had any relationships at all, Hitler had it with Goebbels. I mean, this was his, and Goebbels had better access to Hitler than anyone else. Among a number of contemporary sources documenting the influence of the protest is one here by the Office of Security of Strategic Services, an intelligence memo. That's the predecessor to the CIA. Says a source which is considered trustworthy reports that actions against Jewish wives and husbands on the part of the Gestapo had to be discontinued some time ago because of protests which such action aroused. Well, there are other contemporary documents that, but this is fairly concise. Here's a poem by a survivor, a heartfelt gratitude by a man who survived an intermarriage and whose wife apparently fearlessly demonstrated on Rosenstrasse. And I like the line here, "No one can deny your role." Maybe he sensed already, as we have today, that in fact there are people denying their role. The main narrative about German Jewish survival has really often ignored or denied their role. This is a key transition in the talk for asking whether this denial is due to a sense of reproach by the majority, by a tiny majority. Again, the narrative set by tens of millions who know that resistance wasn't possible, and you have a few people saying, "Oh, I did this," that's not going to be necessarily treated heroically like we might see it here today. Yad Vashem, for example, has a program, and they instigated this wonderful and important program, Righteous Among the Nations, and they're very consistent. They don't recognize Jews because they say a Jew rescuing a Jew is doing what is your own duty. It's what you do. And they also said that, family members, a wife protecting a husband is just what happens in marriage. It's not quite according to divorce statistics we've seen, but, it's logical about, who is noticed for rescue. This Righteousness Among the Nations program identifies rescuers. Post-war German reparations were also not forthcoming. Not for Jewish marriage partners or for the Jews who did not wear the star. They were not considered victims of fascism. For example, one wife of a Jewish husband was rebuffed by a judge after the war for seeking a pension due to hardship as an enemy of fascism. Why didn't you just get divorced? The judge wanted to know. Clearly, getting divorced would have been in the self-interest, as the judge pointed out. By contrast, as a 1997 article in Der Spiegel pointed out, the widow of the notorious Judge Roland Freiser, the Nazi judge, she received a very generous pension in West Germany. The reasoning was that if her husband, the head of the People's Court, had survived, his wife would have been the beneficiary of a very high salary indeed. But Freisler had sent many Germans to the guillotine for treason, including Sophie and Hans Scholl and the others from the White Rose. Another key point here is that all efforts to commemorate and document the resistance of the intermarried Jews and their protest on the Rosenstrasse has been taken on private rather than official initiative. This is the remarkably fitting memorial by a wonderful woman, Inge Hunsinger. In fact, she had money from East Berlin before the wall fell to make this, and when the wall fell, she had to go to court to get West Berlin to continue to fund her, she told me. Now, German commemorations, I think, are also a little bit lacking. In 1990, I gave a talk on the invitation of the German Resistance Memorial on the Rosenstrasse protest by intermarried wives. The room was packed. There were hundreds of Germans there, maybe a couple hundred more. I don't know. Clearly there was interest. But when I asked about where's the brochure, that usually resulted from most such talks, I was told that the memorial had no resources. Apparently, a decision at the German Resistance Memorial had followed that the public is not privy to. What happened to, so that there is no commemoration of the protest at the main German memorial. There's nothing you can find on the intermarried resistance at the Rosenstrasse in the German Resistance Memorial. It's the official memorial in Berlin. Even though there are many smaller incidents that are praised as resistance and carefully documented. Well, one point here is that the Germans are not shy to find acts of resistance, but it's still a little bit of a mystery to me why this is. Another official memorial, Berlin's Topography des Terrors, Topography of Terror, has followed suit and cites just one of many scholarly sources to claim that the protest had no impact. There's actually a rich historiography here going back to Raoul Hilberg and others, H.G. Adler, all of who said that the protest had an impact and caused the release instead of the deportation. Notice, however, that the German judiciary has delivered post-war narratives that disagree. In 1960 trials, indictments, there were two in Berlin, that both concluded that Rosenstrasse protests had caused the regime to release the Rosenstrasse Jews. The 1950 trial of Georg Dengler indicted him for drawing intermarried Jews into the Holocaust as long as this did not draw public attention. That was such a key. The regime didn't want people to know about these intermarried cases. They were embarrassing. A mood report said that the people didn't understand why these were there. And it's, of course, only because of tactics of maintaining Hitler's image. When Hitler compromised, he never compromised on his ideology or his goals. It was only tactically. It was totally promiscuous tactically. Another court decision, this one in 2000, stated that, quote, Aryan spouses were repeatedly advised to separate from their Jewish spouses if they did not wish to share their persecution. The National Socialist rulers regarded everyone who was associated with Jews and refused to part with them as an opponent of the German government. But this was not recognized by people seeking to be considered enemies of fascism. Nonetheless, you can still hear some reasoning that the release of the Jews from Auschwitz, the 25 sent there, was because the local Gestapo had exceeded its authority and had to be smacked back down. But again, that's a picture of a regime of just a mechanical, mechanistic order and following. Let me conclude with a few points about dominant narratives and nonconformity. The prospect that intermarriage and active assimilation rescued Jews also runs headfirst into a Jewish tenet as expressed in 1950 by Bruno Blau, a Jewish statistician who survived in intermarriage. The generally accepted view had been that mixed marriages, like conversion to Christianity, were dangerous for the perpetuation of Judaism, since children born of such mixed marriages, even where one partner remained Jewish, were for the most part reared as non-Jews. But strange as it may seem, the fact that a small number of German Jews were saved from liquidation is due almost entirely to mixed marriages. He was referring to the fact that there were almost 200 full German Jews, other than the full intermarried Jews who survived, and those were probably the ones under the protection of high Nazi officials. Perhaps the most massive reproach to the narrative the intermarried couples wrote came from society itself, both while Hitler ruled and afterward. Arthur Jacobs, the intermarried leader of the German Bund, that had a hand in rescuing 7 or 8 lives, said this: while Hitler was in power, quote, the biggest challenge we faced was not the Gestapo or the camps, but the risk of the regime's inner embrace, the temptation to fit in, the terror of nonconformity. On the other hand, was difficult, but amounted to defiance and led to rescue. This brings us back to the opposing sides of intermarried couples in German society in general. The common society narrative, as described by Heydrich in November 1938, as he considered whether to establish a ghetto in Germany for German Jews. He said, the German population forces the Jews to behave. The control of the Jews through the watchful eye of the whole population is better than having Jews by the thousands in a single district, where I cannot properly establish control over his daily life through uniformed agents. Even uniformed agents weren't going to be, in his calculations, as good as the denunciations of the people. That's what I'm talking about, where an entire population almost works more and more toward compromising and internalizing, practicing National Socialism. You have the small group working the other way, learning opposition. Here is Grodka's diary that proves, in a way, what I was saying, or it's one testimony, an anecdote. Her Jewish husband is not recognized as a victim of fascism because he didn't wear the star. But she asked, haven't such people also had their family members slaughtered? Haven't they also suffered? Weren't they also in continuous danger and open to attack from anyone? And in conclusion, I conclude with an appeal to nonconformity as a way of reaching independent thought and individual conscience. It may well be, in some cases, very good to have a gatekeeper telling you what to believe and what to think. Of course, that's in case this gatekeeper is taking all the arguments and evidence into account. But it's much better, I think, for individuals to develop their own lights by which they make their own judgments. That's what this discussion of narratives reveals to me, at least. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful, and I think there's going to be a good number of questions. We have more than 60 people online who may want to ask some questions. So what I'm going to do first is thank Ken Kennup, Mary Bernard, and Kennedy Ryder for setting up this the virtual part of our lecture. And they are also going to help us manage this kind of unique approach to question and answer. So what I think we'll do is we'll ask, see if there are any online questions, and we'll alternate. So online, in person, online, in person. One other thing, though, if you don't get a chance to ask a question today, we are having a discussion tomorrow. The official title is How Many Hitler Biographies Are Enough? In the Campus Hillel House, hosted by Sam Friedman and myself with Dr. Stoltzfus. And we can have up to 15 or so people there in person, and also if you're a Stetson student, you can sign in through Teams if you write Mary Bernard or Sam Friedman. So I'm mentioning that as well before we get to the questions here. So, Mary, do we have an online question?
We actually do have one that was submitted earlier.
Okay.
Do you think that blood laws in the American South that much predated the Third Reich and criminalized sexual relations between whites and Negroes influenced or emboldened the Nazi obsession with race defilement?
It's a very good question. Of course, it's come up these days, and there's even a Yale law professor who's written a book on this, the American model, Hitler's American model. I think Hitler could have thought of this himself, of course, and of course anti-Semitism was across Europe. Now the question of emboldening is different because when the Nazis, for example, wanted to make propaganda for involuntary sterilization, they showed the flags of all the countries that already had involuntary sterilization. We are not alone, we have this context. Hitler was not interested in stirring up dissent. He wanted all the pillars of support, and especially his mass movement. But I don't see any evidence in that book. They refer to the early and mid-30s, some Nazi lawyers coming to the U.S., and they say that in some states, the racial laws in this country were much more severe than those by the Nuremberg laws. And in fact, there were some state laws that said even a drop of African or black blood makes you a non-white person. And as we know, the Nuremberg laws only counted a minority of the people with half Jewish blood. Speaking of this, using this terminology, half Jews were often not considered Jewish, but that's that's leaving out these political reasons that Hitler only was using lesser definitions. I don't know to what extent these laws were enforced in the South. I believe it was states but certainly this program of the Nazis was much more systematic and much more serious and cut into the fabric of German society and German economy and German culture. Half of the Nobel Prizes from Germany were held by Jews. So let alone you talk about the banking sector, you talk about the professional sectors. You had a major job to segregate Jews. Just to say that you had some similarity in laws is not anywhere close to saying that you had the inspiration, because that for the same reason that Hitler didn't begin with the Holocaust. You could identify Jews, but it took a long time to isolate them socially, to concentrate them, and then to annihilate them. These were steps. And I see, it's nice that people want to question us and take us away from our complacency in our country. And this is happening more these days. But I don't see a lot of indications that this was that Hitler wouldn't have thought of this on his own.
Right. That's a good point. Okay, so Doctor, I'll bring the microphone up. Dr. Coggins.
Thank you very much for coming to share. I know you're familiar with the Florida Statute 1003.42G that requires the teaching of the Holocaust. One of the areas in that statute, I serve in the Holocaust Commission for the state of Florida, and one of the weaknesses is what you gave tonight. No emphasis is placed on intermarriage and placed on the role of women. And when I leave here tonight, I'm going to go back and suggest that we really concentrate on that. Why? Because Section S in the statute requires we talk about women. So we have a law that requires we teach about this. And my question, thank you for coming, my question is basically this. Do you think there was lots of complicity in the U.S. at the highest level? You mentioned the Office of Strategic Intelligence. But when we have double crossing, when Jews came all the way to Miami and our government sent them back to go into concentration camps, many of them, I'd like you to really comment on the complicity that this U.S. government displayed during that period.
During World War II?
Yes.
The complicity, yes. Well, of course, corporations like DuPont and IBM, notoriously complicit, and we have scholarship on that. But first of all, I want to thank you very much for taking that to the Holocaust Commission. And it is another reason that that historians have argued for the kind of overlooking of this event, that these were women. And of course, that would be a continuation of the Nazi narrative that women just can't be taken seriously politically. There was some difference there, but this is not going to, it's something to take into account. Now, in terms of complicity, right, I think we've seen that there's something universal about this. Psychologically, we're the same. I wrote a column in 2016, are we better than Weimar Germans? Would we act any differently? And there seem to be some very telling parallels in terms of repeating social mechanisms and how people act when we're in society that carry over. And so certainly we have that great fortune of not having experienced a situation like this yet. When I first started teaching, and this was almost 30 years ago, 1994, 95, I would ask my students whether it could happen here. And this was, usually said, no, that was, they felt like we knew democracy. We would never give up our freedom. And I teach this because I love to try to evoke a sense of parallels without saying it, just to jar the awareness. And one young man said, well, we'll never have it here because we have a lot of guns. If we see the fascists coming, we'll pick up out and shoot them. Which is sort of funny, but it's also a little bit tragic. So I would, of course, say that under similar pressures, you know, as wonderful as our democracy has been, we're training in other things as well as democracy. I think certainly we have more practice in being consumers, for example, than being members of democracy.
Well, that's an excellent point, right? And Germany was a center of consumption in the 1920s
Yeah.
as well, and maybe not as good at practicing democracy. Great. Do we have Mary, any other online questions? I see there are 23 notes in the chat and 4 in the Q&A, so I'm assuming there's something.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, what did Dr. Stoltzfus do with the star patch he's given?
Okay.
Oh, it was stolen from my office. I had it in a folder because I always used it to teach. And I was very open about having students use my office. And one day when I went to find this in my folder to teach, it wasn't there. And I don't know, when I had it, someone actually tried to buy it, saying, you know, we see these stars all around, but one of us actually worn is worth a lot.
Wow.
It is a thing for me, but at least I still have the image. And I have the story.
Yeah, wow. Before we go back to online, yes, okay, got a couple student questions. Is that cool? Okay, so go ahead.
So when you were discussing like the terminology, like, oops. Okay. So when you were okay. So when you were discussing like the terminology, like prune. You want me to just not use it?
Yeah, go ahead. Just speak loudly.
So when you were discussing the terminology, like.
I'm stopping.
Right. You know, they made some progress from their perspective in driving Jews out of Germany, but when they annexed Austria, for example, all of a sudden they had hundreds of thousands more Jews. I did want to say that your question about intermarriage and its use, in 1935, there were memos going around among bureaucrats saying by intermarriage now we mean interracial, not interdenominational. So they took a term. I think it's very telling about the Nazis. They had revolutionary kinds of steps, but they tried to use familiar means and put it in old wineskins. But in terms of when Hitler was December of 1938, 1 month after Kristallnacht, that Hitler divided these intermarriages, about 2/3 or 3/4 were privileged, 1/3. If you had children who were members of a Jewish community, you were not privileged. Or if you had no children and the Jewish partner was a woman, that was a Jewish household. That was done a month after Kristallnacht, according to one of my interviewees who was in a position to know, because after Kristallnacht, the regime learned that Jews married to non-Jews were in a position to have their family members make a bigger noise and through better connections. And so they tried, and they had previously divided that problem of half-Jews the same way at the Nuremberg laws. Most of them were not considered Jewish. If a half-Jew belonged to the Jewish community or was married to a Jew, then that person was considered a Jew, counted as a Jew. So they're trying to do the same thing here. once they see how recalcitrant this group of intermarried couples is, Hitler issues this secretly, doesn't want his authority on the line here, then it's ironic that they get it all wrong. They go according to the household, but I'm not sure that men would have been as quick to protest. It's interesting to also consider whether there are particularly female forms of resistance. Men might have thought of, like, grabbing a bomb and blowing things up or shooting or something. But it didn't start as a protest. It started by people who came to make sure their husbands were there, and then solidarity developed and the protest developed. But
Question, by the way, about why would he intervene and then decide to start making these? And that answer was really helpful, that it was because the Germans weren't voluntarily divorcing their Jewish spouses, right? Do we have an online question before we get to Ryan over here? Mary?
We do have several more. So the next is, Dr. Stoltzfus, how did you first hear about the Rosenstrasse protest?
Well, that's a wonderful question too. It was a stroke of luck. I was at Harvard University. I had a Fulbright to go, and I shifted my focus somewhat when I heard about this. There was a mentor, Gene Sharp, who was interested in what he called nonviolent sanctions. How could you practice power without the barrel of a gun? And he came up with all kinds of ways, a couple hundred or more, and he directed me to this, and he said, maybe there are letters from children, or maybe children, go look. And another professor at Harvard said, well, how can you spend a whole Fulbright year looking at this little incident? But I interpreted it much more broadly. And I found out about it that way. It survived, really, I think, because of a December 1945 article in a newspaper called Z, that means her. It's a women's magazine where the one Jewish person imprisoned there wrote this story, Gayard Sivier, who's a very powerful author. And he said, everybody was rushing around in Germany trying to make world history. They had their eye on this magnificent right, and they overlooked this flame that could have burst into a broader resistance if people had noticed. But that we don't want to assume that everybody wanted to resist, which is one reason I always object to. The only explanation that Germans didn't resist was because of terror. You can't assume that everybody wanted to resist. But that was picked up by some sort of peace newspaper in the 1970s, and Gene Sharp had read that. And there were up to 18 places where I saw this protest identified in 1985. But they all were just a paragraph. And no one tried to, and even the historians I mentioned who said that the protest was the reason for the release, didn't really push it to see what did that mean about the regime. I think it's certainly it made sense in their minds, in their idea of the regime, how the regime worked, that a protest could have had that impact. That's what's significant. But I remember Gene Sharp, and I talked to Raoul Hilberg as well, and they both emphasized, go find out how decisions were made. How are you going to, this is a study of the regime and its workings.
Excellent. So I think we have time for two more online and two more questions in the room before 8:30. So Ryan, you're next.
My question would be, what was the aftermath for the Rosenstrasse protesters? Were they subject to further legal investigation? Did the Gestapo harass them? Were there attempts to deport any of them discreetly rather than publicly?
It's such a good question, and it's because of the Gestapo's effort to, include them in this removal of Jews from German territory that this collection, and only in Berlin, I think, could this have happened. Only in Berlin were that many intermarried, and only in Berlin was Goebbels looking over this, and also where so many journalists and ambassadors of neutral countries were paying attention. Anecdotally, one told me that after that, another place where they met in public, that was outlawed totally from the earliest days of the Reich, that more than 10 people or something you couldn't gather in public, certainly not to express an opinion. They said that at the line where they got their food ration cards, they started grumbling and talking out loud about how if anything happened again, they were going to do something else. I'm not sure that made a big difference. I think the main point here is that the regime and they just simply would have required a lot more effort and the Gestapo agents than they had time for once after the Stalingrad defeat, after these bombings, and that slow pushing of the German army all the way back to Berlin. So that's the context. There is a testimony by a Nazi who was leader of an Einsatz group in Ohlendorf. After the war, he was in October of 1944, he testified after the war, he was asked to go in one city, Dusseldorf, door to door of intermarried couples and shoot the Jewish partner. And he refused, I suppose for various reasons, but certainly opportunism at that point looked like it might be in not following Hitler's order. Of course, that didn't save him.
Right. And wasn't Himmler by this time refusing to deport more Jews so he could look?
That's a good point.
Yeah, so
right.
It's not that surprising if Ohlendorf also refused to do it.
Exactly.
Great. So online and then Olivia. Yeah. So another online question, Mary?
Yeah. So how do you think reflection and memory about these events impact modern German culture and society? And what can we in the U.S. learn from that approach?
Wow. That in German they would say, well, ask me something easier. And first of all, it has to be said that Germany rightfully has a great reputation for dealing with its past. It's just not fully complete, just like ours. We haven't really done very well. There's this new book by a friend of mine, Susan Neiman, who was on a Fulbright Fellowship when I was there, about this question, and she thinks that Germany is a role model for the United States in terms of dealing with the genocide, one could say, of the native populations here, and certainly slavery. We're still dealing with that in the last year. All of these memorials coming down at last, and people using the Confederate flag as a sign of resistance to democracy, to liberal understandings of what our society should be. So we certainly have more to learn, I think, than the Germans, who have really bent to the task of commemoration.
I know a lot of the examples you used in the protests were German women who had Jewish husbands. Was it as common for Jewish men to have German wives as husbands? Wait, no. Hold on. German men to have Jewish wives as spouses, and was the situation different for them, or what was that like?
It's a very good question, and thanks for asking it. This is not an easy topic. There are so many sorts of asterisks, but first of all, these they did exist, but in lesser numbers, for whatever reason, and that's interesting too to discuss in terms of gender. Why were most of the intermarriages women? and the minority German men marrying these majority German women. But the main reason there is that privileged status went with the husband. So if the husband was non-Jewish, then that was a non-Jewish household, and the woman was automatically privileged. So didn't even wear the star. And that really, I remember some of the first responses to my book was outrage that I was mixing up these categories of people who had suffered, and I certainly didn't intend to do that. But in fact, there was a range of sanctions against German Jews as well, depending on marriage.
Okay, so we'll conclude with one more question from that line, Mary, and then Dr. Fowler will have a question live, I suppose. So, Mary?
Okay, so there's actually two questions that are related, so I'm going to combine them here. What was the process of tracking down the Rosenstolz protesters back in the 80s, and were they forthcoming about their stories?
Well, that's such a good question, too. And I can't take credit for the idea myself. It was an expat, a wonderful woman living in Berlin, who said, you should advertise in the newspapers, you should go on radio. And I did. And I was immediate. And I never had a telephone answering machine before. And in Germany, they're very expensive, 900 marks. But I got one instantly because I was missing too many important calls. I got a lot of calls, and most of them were forthcoming. And I remember only one who says, well, what do you pigs want? And, it's... And then I got some crank calls, too, I think, where people were claiming that there were, other things, or that there were other things more interesting I could be researching. That's what really unleashed these interviews. Oh, that plus looking in court documents. I mentioned Annie Radlauer. I also met, I looked in the phone book. There was Georg Cuvier's wife. I looked in the phone book. Here's Annie Radlauer's testimony. Here she is in the phone book. I had a phone book very close, and I would jump up. And that's what also led me to interview this deputy of Goebbels, Leopold Bucher. There was his testimony, and he was living in Aachen, and he was eager to talk. I also contacted somebody else in Eichmann's office. I interviewed him on the phone. He agreed to meet me, but when I was there, he didn't answer the door. It was, and especially Eichmann's secretaries were very eager to hear from me, because they were deposed there as well. It's an American term. Interviewed.
Thank you so much for this amazing talk. I have so many questions, so I'll try to keep it minimal. So my first is kind of on a basic level, why did women do it? I mean, did they really love their husbands so much? Or was it some of this learned behavior? And related to that, did you find any difference in the ways that women talked about this between East and West Germany? I mean, in East Germany, they're living under another totalitarian regime. Did some of this learned opposition kind of carry over? And then in the years of talking about this book and following up on it, what can you tell us about intermarriage in the other regions of Nazi occupation, right? I mean, obviously there were intermarried couples, but I can't imagine any kind of similar protest in Poland, for example, right? But what about in France? Was there any recourse? And I also just want to say, I love this question of gender and resistance. And we just, in my Eastern Europe course, today we're reading a book by Shauna Penn about Solidarity's women and how the Solidarity movement after martial law continued precisely because of the women involved in the movement. And yet they were not remembered, they were not interviewed by Western journalists, and in a way they themselves wrote themselves out of the story. And I think there's a larger question of how we remember gender in resistance and why women's stories are often erased. Thank
Well,
you.
thank you very much. I'll start with the latest, and you can remind me of the earlier questions, please. You know, the question of writing themselves out of the story, you know, these women never thought of themselves as heroes. They never demanded a page. And so what we're trying to do at the Rosenstrasse Foundation is record the stories of these intermarried couples and create a sense of singularity. These people, the descendants, survived because of the intermarriage pushback, and so that's our mission, really, to create that constituency. Now, you had a question about in the territories, and it's of course a good one, and it has to do with the fact that only within the Third Reich did, well, not only, but within the Third Reich, Hitler's image mattered. The Hitler myth, not out in Poland. In Poland, if you didn't get divorced, then both people were taken off. And in France, though, another factor came in. It was in 1943, I believe, after the Rosenstrasse protest, that, and I'm not sure about that, Holland asks, and then France asks, Eichmann's office, what do we do with our intermarried Jews? Should we deport them now? And the answer comes back, we haven't yet done it in the Reich, so don't do it there yet. There was some sense of, what is that? Anyway, I know, I connected perhaps with Goebbels in Berlin, wanting to be the first or decisive person as to whether intermarried Jews would be deported. There was certainly a sense of hierarchy and protocol there. So the West was obviously treated different from the East.
Was
you
that
had two
everything?
questions before that.
Did they really love their husbands?
Oh, it's such a good question. That's such a good question. And well, there was one couple who had already decided to divorce, and when the sake of a life was at stake, they decided not to. And you can imagine how challenging that would be, because it was quickly known that this was Elsa called it a silk thread, that they hung by a silk thread. And so the sake of a life, certainly. And no, I can't, and there was one couple, Charlotte and Julius Israel, who got divorced after the war. This must have played havoc with their marriage, and we arrange of reasons. It's some of it having to do maybe with practicing against the grain. I don't know. And then you had another question, the second one.
Yeah. Were there legacies of this after 1945?
I gave a talk at the Humboldt University in October, just before the wall fell, when there were protests out in the street, and no one said a peep about that, and it's understandable. I mean, in other words, certain things were not as open to discussion. Generally, protests were not that well received either place. They connected them maybe with, Joschka Fischer and these radicals in the 60s. But and especially in that older generation, I noticed they seemed to have the same cultural take or habits. Now, among younger East Germans and West Germans, there were differences, but it was only in East Germany that Inge Hunsinger began to make this memorial.
Wow. So there you go. So I'm sure there are other great questions. I'm going to encourage everyone online, especially if you're a Stetson student, to write Mary or Sam Friedman, and you can ask them tomorrow during our session, which will have that virtual aspect, or come directly to Campus Hilo. For everyone else, thank you for coming, and especially thank you, Dr. Stoltzfus, for this wonderful talk and very relevant. Thank you. Yeah. All right. This is great. So anyone who wants to come down and chat with Dr. Stoltzfus, you can. Otherwise, we are concluding officially tonight. And so you can also stop recording, Mary, if you like. Thank you.
Where have you been hiding?
Yes, hi.
Thank you for coming. Here's
You're
my
welcome.
card.
Oh, thank you. Yes, let's be in touch. I have a card. Yes,
We need you because
I'm happy.
nobody's addressing this issue.
Amazing.
Nobody.
And even though women, yeah, I didn't know that.
Nobody.
That's so important that it all mentions
Everybody
women in
talks about everything
specifically.
else, but
Yeah.
not about women.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
and when you look at the double crossing, on that boat was 928 individuals.
Yeah, really.
50% were women.
Wow.
That
You
came
know,
right
I've
up to
heard of,
Miami. Came right up to Miami.
Uh-huh.
Our gunboats pointed them back to Europe.
right,
No, yes.
right.
So
Right.
I'm so glad that you.
Well, I'm so glad to meet you. Now, how are we going to stay in touch? We'll have to email immediately.
Yes.
And,
if you email me, I'm going to send your name to
Yes.
the commission
Yes,
so that we can circulate it to all
Yes,
the Holocaust
okay.
sites because they really
Yeah.
need to address this
yes.
issue of women.
And, well, that's why it's in the law.
Yes, it's
And
in
we
the
need to
law.
follow up. We've got a good leverage point.
Yes. Yeah, you see, because
So
the
happy you
problem is
introduced yourself.
The law said teach about the Holocaust, but it gives no guidance as to where the focus should be. And since there's a law that says teach about women, why can't we address
Right.
the
Oh,
role
yeah.
of women in the Holocaust? It's just like the role of women in the civil
Wow,
rights movement.
wow, yeah.
Nobody talks about them except this last election.
Amazing.
All of a sudden,
Oh, and look what
Stacey
black women are
Adams.
doing. Stacey Adams.
Yeah.
But look, you know, the ones who are going into politics, bottoms, and you know, these are the
but they've
powerhouses.
always been
I
behind
was just-
serious international movements. It's been the young people
Uh-huh.
and women.
Right. Young
Men
people,
play a
women,
neutral
yes.
role.
Well, young people have their idealism, and women have their outsiderness. I don't know what it is, but we need to promote that. I agree. Everybody.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Let's. We'll be in email. I'm so glad.
Cleo here drove to the other coast because she had a family
Oh,
came back.
you did that all in one
She
day?
really wanted to come. She's in the Jewish studies class.
Isn't that wonderful? Well, I hope it was rewarding. Uh-huh.
The reason, like, I personally don't celebrate traditions of Judaism or Jewish aspects. My mother's mother, my grandmother was Jewish, and they celebrate. So I'm very, like, I'm very familiar with, like, I knew boys and lots of, that's all I did. So, and then when I was in this class, and I'm also rabbi class, I was learning everything under the sun. My mom was telling me some things, you know, traditions and stuff, and it was just interesting to learn, you know?
It's interesting to learn, yes.
That's weird because I'm Baptist Orthodox.
Oh, you're Greek Orthodox? So is my wife.
Stavropoulos.
Yes, my dad was born in Greece, my mom was in New York. So it happened,
His wife, his partner's Greek.
Yes, my partner's Greek. And I see Greek signs all around here in Florida.
and I was born in Tarpon Springs.
Oh, Tarpon Springs, of course. I know, I've been through that. It's, well, how wonderful. How wonderful. I'm so glad you were here. And you're in Jewish studies. Okay, that's a minor, right?
No, I was debating it. I was
Uh-huh.
not sure just because I'm a whole science major and I'm very
Oh, okay.
overwhelmed. And I was debating.
Yeah, 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 yeah,
Currently, I'm not being,
yeah.
pick it back up.
Right, right, right.
More time to catch up.
Well, you know, I once was accepted into a program that had a lot of economics and math, and it just wasn't me. So I had to go around it in what looked like a reversal of my career prospects, but eventually I found history.
And I'll tell you what, history's holding on to
Yeah, 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 yeah. Right, right. So what part of Greece, what village was your?
My dad was born in Patra, and
Patra, of course, the Peloponnese.
and my grandmother, his mother, and all his family over there in Santorini.
All these islands, Cyclades, yeah.
On the island, I was 3 years old.
Uh-huh.
I've been back since that.
I see, yeah. Yeah, 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 you want to get that. Wow, so why did you go to Clearwater?
Oh, I went unfortunately.
Oh, right, right, right. But it hits you hard. Really? Oh, you're so welcome. Right, right, right. I appreciate that. I hope we meet again.
So, all right. Want to grab a drink before?
Sure, if you want to. I don't know how much time you have. You have these pressures of.
Well, my kids are older and maybe fun.
I want to hear all about it.
You can get one.
Maybe a beer, sure. Yeah.
Because we do have to.
Right. No, that's right. I can't. But yeah, that'll be good. That'll be good.
I have Rabbi Olsen's
Oh, right, that's right. Okay.
Maybe I can come in.
No, I mean, look, you went above and beyond. That's really remarkable. So,
That's good. So, what was your name again? Oh, good question. Okay. Okay, I've got. I think I have everything. Thank you. Oh, good. Yeah, that's nice. Appreciate that. Well, I know they usually last about a year, and then they're crumpled and they get moved out. Good, good, good. Yeah, yeah. And what was your name again? Cleopatra, right? And Stavropoulos. Oh yeah, no wonder Polis is from the Peloponnese. You can tell all of these things. Well, no, but certain names are deriving from certain areas.